1 of this video, we're going to look at cadences in music, specifically the authentic cadence and the half cadence. A cadence in music can be defined as the harmonized ending of a musical phrase. Just like in language, the perceived segmentation of information is important for us to gain meaning from the experience. While music is not a language per se, it does have some of the same characteristics that language has. For example, both language and music stream to our consciousness in a time-based way. The human mind tends to seek order in this stream of information, so we use things like phrasing, punctuation, and meter to establish this order. Let's take, for example, this simple children's nursery rhyme, Simple Simon. Simple Simon met a pieman, going to the fair. Says Simple Simon to the pieman, "Let me taste your ware." In this simple poem, the author uses phrasing, punctuation, repetition, and rhyming, all to create order out of this stream of information. So as we listen to this poem, our brains can break this down into 4 subphrases, each with an accompanying punctuation mark. And these subphrases combine to create 2 primary phrases, which are related by the rhyming words fair and where. The repeated ideas in the first subphrase and the third subphrase help us to connect the 2 ideas together. If you were to read this poem aloud, you would probably put a pause after the word fair, because you would instinctively understand that this is all the first phrase. Similarly, if you were to read this aloud, you would probably end on the word where, with a slightly changed tone, a more conclusive tone in your voice. This is because you understand that the second phrase is a conclusion to the first. It's possible for music to work in a similar way. While we won't get into all of the details of phrase and form, it is important to understand phrasing in order to understand cadences. Many have found a relationship between punctuation in poetry and prose with the cadences that we know in music. Punctuation, like question marks or exclamation points, have a certain grammatical function. In music, cadences function in a similar way. They allow us to hear phrases, much like questions and answers. We find this kind of phrase grouping all the time in music. We call these phrases antecedent and consequent phrases, and they are defined largely by the cadences that they use. Let's look at a musical example that shows this in action. Here's the opening from a movement from the famous Water Music Suite of George Frederick Handel. As you listen to this excerpt, notice how Handel uses the similar motivic ideas of the first 2 measures to create unity between phrase 1 and phrase 2. Notice also that the phrase does not stop or slow down. It simply continues. Yet because of the metrical continuity and the harmonic cadences, we do hear 2 distinct phrases at work here. Let's take a listen. But what are these cadences, and how do we identify them in a musical score? Let's start with one of the most important cadences, the one that concludes this musical excerpt. Here at the end we can see the dominant going to the tonic. This is what we call in music an authentic cadence. The cadence at the end of the first phrase has the tonic going to the dominant. Phrases that end with the dominant chord are called half cadences. Some half cadences are approached by a tonic chord, but this is not necessary. Basically, any phrase that ends with the dominant is considered a half cadence. Let's take a closer look at these 2 cadence types. Let's start with the authentic cadence. The authentic cadence can be broken down into 2 types. the perfect authentic cadence and the imperfect authentic cadence. We can abbreviate these PAC or IAC in scores rather than writing out all three words. The perfect authentic cadence is the most conclusive of all cadence types. We can identify it as a 5-to-1, where the tonic, or first scale degree, is in the uppermost voice. Perfect authentic cadences are applied to melodies where the voice moves by stepwise motion to the tonic, either from above or from the leading tone below. With imperfect authentic cadences, the 5-to-1 ends with either the third or the fifth in the uppermost voice. The imperfect authentic cadence tends to sound less conclusive, and so we find it usually in interior phrases and not at the ends of large phrase groups. Now let's look at the half cadence. A half cadence, as we said before, is any cadence or termination of a phrase that ends on the dominant. In a half cadence, the dominant can be approached by a predominant chord like the 2, the 6, or the 4, or it can be approached simply from the tonic. When one hears a half cadence in an early phrase, the expectation is that a subsequent phrase will resolve that dominant with a perfect or imperfect authentic cadence. The type of cadence used is often the product of the melody that's being harmonized. Here's a melody from Beethoven's famous Ninth Symphony, often referred to as the Ode to Joy. Notice how each of these two phrases begins with the same musical material. The first, however, ends on the second scale degree. Because the second scale degree is part of the dominant harmony, this suggests that you would end the first phrase with a half cadence. The second phrase, while beginning the same way, ends instead on the tonic. This suggests a perfect authentic cadence, as an answer to the first phrase, which ended on the dominant. Let's take a listen to the first phrase, and then let's analyze the final two chords and the voice leading that's taking place. Notice that the first cadence at the end of the first phrase is a 1 to a 5. Here we can see the classic F progression that we learned several lessons ago. Two voices moving by step and one common tone. The second phrase ends with a 5-to-1. Chords also related by fourth or fifth. But because of the melodic movement of the upper voice, we can't use the traditional F progression. Here we will introduce a new type of F progression, something we'll call F2. An F2 progression has one voice moving by step and two voices moving by third. F2 progressions are often found in perfect authentic cadences where the melodic or upper voice moves from the second to the first scale degree. So we will call our original F progression F1, and we'll call this new F progression F2. Remember, F stands for chords whose roots are related by fourth or fifth. Let's listen to both phrases together now that we have the cadences in place and good voice leading in each. Now let's look at more cadences in a well-known musical example. This is the hymn Amazing Grace. Notice that there are two phrases. Listen to this work and see if you can identify the cadences at the end of the first phrase and at the end of the second phrase. Also, at the end of the second phrase, see if you can identify which progression is being used. Is it F1 or F2? At the end of the first phrase, we have a half cadence, ending with the dominant. Phrase 2 ends with a perfect authentic cadence. It's considered perfect because the tonic A flat is in the upper voice. And because we ended with the second to first scale degree in the melody, we used an F2 progression. Remember, the F2 progression means that the chords are related by fourth or fifth. In an F2, two voices move by third and one by step. The one by step in this perfect authentic cadence is always the second to first scale degree in the melody. This is the end of part 1. Be sure to tune in to part 2 to know about the plagal cadence, the deceptive cadence, and the Phrygian half cadence. This is Dr. Sander. See you next time.